as to this evening and for really this little series myself, I apologize that I did something that I often do, and sometimes I apologize for it and sometimes I don't. And that has to do with the fact that the individual titles within the series, I often don't adhere to them at all and talk about something else. And that's what I did last week.
It was good.
And well, thank you that it was still good. And so now I kind of will draw the material together, and I think my main focus will be on something that is very, very important within the context of our culture, but I will still live up a little bit to my old promise and say, well, all right, and I didn't mention much about that at all last time. What were the direct, let's say, undiluted Eastern influences, primarily from India, that came to bear upon Los Angeles, and that became very significant here? Well, in order to do that, a nice little metaphorical expression comes to us from ancient Rome, and it's the word pontifex, which means a bridge builder. And primarily the high priest of the ancient Roman religion was called the Pontifex Maximus, the highest bridge builder between heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. And you know who inherited and still wears that title? The Pope of Rome, Pontifex Maximus. Wow. They never abandoned that term. Now, of course, can be interpreted in various ways, and that is, of course, the ancient Roman interpretation. But let's say there is also a legitimate metaphorical interpretation that we can bring in our times, namely that there were, maybe still, and there still are people, who are the bridge builders between East and West, who try to combine the ancient spirituality which we have inherited from the Alexandrian period and so forth, that originated to a major extent in Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Hermeticism, try to combine that with what increasingly they came to learn from the East. And you know, there is a lot of colonialism has a lot of bad press, which sometimes is legitimate and sometimes isn't, and which is, let's say, as a reality, it certainly had been done away with very quickly in the United States. But you know, if it hadn't been for the British Raj in India, I think the bridge building between Eastern and Western spirituality would have been considerably slowed down, because that was the, in many ways, that was the framework for the bridge building. Now, once again, as far as United States is concerned, maybe even as far as Los Angeles is concerned, when did the East-West bridge building take place, and what did it do? Well, I don't want to sound partial, just because we are in the building of the Theosophical Society, and just because I have been a member of the Theosophical Society for 65 years, you know, I joined as a baby. It was easier to do in those days. But in any event, I can't express it any otherwise that the first and in many ways really extremely important bridge builders as far as the United States and the wisdom of the East were concerned, was the Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 in New York City. It was only a matter of months when the founders, Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, departed for India, where they were invited by a kind of a Hindu reform organization, the Arya Samaj. I'm sure you're terribly interested in these names, but in any event, all kinds of pretty extravagant promises were made to Blavatsky and Olcott from India, so they went there, oh well, this would be a great thing to do. Well, they found out that the promises for the most part were not kept, and they were pretty disappointed with that particular contact. However, they were there already, and they said, well, all is said and done. This is a pretty nice place. It's a little bit warm, but people gathered around them already, and they became friendly with a lot of locals and so forth, and so they came to buy a piece of property which the society still has in Adyar, outside of what used to be called Madras, and now it's called Chennai in the south of India and the Bay of Bengal, and the headquarters of Theosophical Society remained there, and from then on it functioned as an international organization, but with a pretty heavily Indian emphasis. Now, however, that development did not have an awful lot of impact right away on the United States, where they really started. That took quite a while, but a little bit please pardon the history, I promise you I'll get away from it. I know most people consider history boring, because the way it's presented generally, it really is boring. I try to not present it that way, but anyway, about 20 years later, 1893 in Chicago, there occurred a, how should I put it, a big umbrella event, which was it probably had another name too, I didn't look it up, the World Exhibition. Tremendous big thing. They built a whole city of the Chicago, the White City, and all of that.
The World's Fair.
That's it, the World Fair, yeah, that's right. It isn't fair that I didn't remember that. But yes, and within the context of that World Fair, there was something that they organized that came to be called the World Parliament of Religions. And it was really quite a pioneering event. A nice book has been published about it. And it had in 93, 1093, it was the centenary in Chicago, and we had a big blowout there, which was the centenary of the World Parliament of Religions. That was really the beginning of what I wonder whether Professor Jacob Needleman is still alive. I haven't heard that he died. Very interesting man from the Bay Area. But it was Needleman who wrote, I don't know whether it was a title of a book or just the title of a chapter in his book. I said, "The Ganges flows west." In other words, the influences were coming in from India. And there was particularly one man there who was such a dynamic speaker, I am sure with a heavy Indian accent, but that just probably enhanced the charm of his presentations, who really put the Eastern wisdom, particularly of India, all of a sudden on the map. And that was Swami Vivekananda, who in turn was a personal disciple of one of the great, the 3 or 4 truly great saints of the last 150 years from India, Sri Ramakrishna. And Vivekananda really conquered the interest of the people who were there at the World Parliament of Religions. He apparently was a fabulous spellbinder. And then, inasmuch as he attracted so much favorable attention, he was also a smart man and a good businessman, and said, why in the heck should I go home to India? So there are a lot of people interested here. So he started traveling around the country, setting up buildings and temples and things of that sort, which came to be subsumed under the name of the Vedanta Society. And he came to Southern California too. He had a nose for where there might be really interested people. And first, the Vedanta people built and purchased a number of properties in the Pasadena area. So that's where the first Vedanta societies were located. But as it happens in Southern California, everything has got to come to Hollywood, If it doesn't come to Hollywood, it's not going to amount to anything. So, sure enough, as the decades went by, Swami Vivekananda had gone back to India and then passed away and so forth. Periodically, some important Swami of that particular Vedantian order, founded by Ramakrishna, would come over here and run the show. And so, once again, a very astute Swami, the late Swami Prabhavananda, whom I had the pleasure of having some dealings with, he looked formidable. He had a head like a bull and a neck like a bull and big shoulders. You didn't want to tackle with that fellow. But he seemed like a nice man. And my original dealings with him was because about 3 or 4 of us, mostly from the Theosophical Society, we gathered around an old gentleman, the late Reverend Leslie Lowe, who was a Soto Zen priest. He was, as far as we know, the first Hakujin, non-Asian Buddhist priest in this neck of the woods. Very nice old gentleman. And so practically nobody was interested in Buddhism. What's that? However, we organized a couple of times a year, we organized a big festival. And one of them was, at the time in May, the Vesak Festival, big Buddhist holiday. And the Japanese Buddhist community was fairly supportive. And so at the Koyasan temple, which is one of the most beautiful Buddhist places of worship in Los Angeles, on First Street, we had a Vesak celebration. They offered us the premises, and our speaker was Swami Prabhavananda. And he gave a wonderful talk about Buddha. Was really, so that's when I first sort of met him and talked with him and so forth. And then subsequently, now and then, I ran into him at the Vedanta Society or elsewhere. Very dynamic gentleman, And like a lot of people who come over here from Asia, he had a nose not only for spirituality, but he had a nose for real estate. And he bought up practically the whole area, going up from, let's say, now the freeway runs through it, but just, let's say, west of Argyle Avenue, all that hillside up around there. He bought all the houses. They all belonged to the Vedanta Society, and then they started building, which is still there, a very nice medium, small-sized temple. And now even the street where it is located is called Vedanta Place. Very nice place. And now somehow with his leadership and his financial acumen, all of a sudden things started happening. And I would say, from what I could discern, it's a matter of personal judgment, let's say the crème de la crème of people who were interested in spiritual things was all of a sudden up there on Vedanta, which is now Vedanta Place, led by the redoubtable, the greatest novelist of his time, Aldous Huxley, his close friend and advisor, the philosopher Gerald Hurd, both of them expatriate Brits, and a third one also British, who he was sort of a very interesting and very charming man, but somehow he was somewhat in the shadow of the other two Englishmen and of Swami Prabhavananda, who was Christopher Isherwood. And if you are fond of musical comedy, then you will be as fond, or almost as fond as I am, of cabaret, and that which is entirely based on the original book, the Berlin Diaries of Christopher Isherwood. And first ever movie was made of it called, the black and white movie was called I Am a Camera. Because that's how Isherwood started his book, saying, I am just describing, I'm taking pictures of what's going on, so I am a camera. It's a wonderful book, and it was also a wonderful movie. And then a musical was made of it called Cabaret, and Mr. Isherwood said, well, that's going to be a real loss. I know I'm not going to make a penny on that. And he made more money on that than on all of his other books added together. And I met him a few times at the Vedanta Society. He has also been here, and he was the most charming individual, truly, that you might want to meet. Very low key, very, very charming, very much standing in the shadow of Aldous Huxley, which was easy to do because Aldous Huxley was tall and majestic looking man, I remember him on our first meeting here, again the reminiscences of an old man, our first meeting on a Sunday afternoon, the first public lecture was given by Manly Palmer Hall up on the stage, and Gerald Hurd gave the second. Every Sunday we had an event like that. And the second Sunday was Gerald Hurd's lecture. And so Mr. Hurd was up there. He was also archetypal looking gentleman, very, very delicate, had a beard which not too many people had at that time, very slender, and he, at least to me, he always seemed to have a somewhat frightened expression on his face, as if he expected something nasty to happen, or that maybe something nasty happened a little while ago, which may have, how do I know? But in any event, fabulous speaker and a tremendous thinker. Hardly anybody knows about him now, but he was really the philosopher of Aldous Huxley. He was Aldous Huxley's philosophical advisor. So Mr. Hurd was up there speaking, and back right over there in front of that window, which was not a stained glass window yet, there sat the most, again sort of hidden away, the most striking looking man, and that was Aldous Huxley. Tall, aquiline profile, beautiful, long, wavy, grey hair, physique. I mean, I'm not an expert on masculine beauty, but if I ever saw a beautiful man, it was Aldous Huxley. And of course, he was as beautiful inside as he was outside. In any event, these were the core people, the stellar group that gathered at the Vedanta Society. And Gerald Hurd and Huxley and Isherwood, they sort of rotated. They gave the Sunday morning talks there for a long, long time. And then particularly Isherwood did a lot of literary work with and for Swami Prabhavananda, including translations of Hindu scriptures, various things of that sort. It was really Isherwood who remained utterly faithful to Swami Prabhavananda to the end. That was his guru, and that was it, and no two bits about it. He was very, very devoted to Swami Prabhavananda. Needless to say, Huxley and Hurd somewhat went their own way afterwards, which also included LSD research and things of that sort. But under the Vedantian influence, Huxley did some wonderful things too. Among them, he made which is really worth looking at. It is called the Perennial Philosophy. And it was really a collection of quotations from innumerable sources of the esoteric tradition, East and West, and organized in such a way that they showed a topical connection. And it's really one of the most wonderful source books of mysticism and of the esoteric tradition. That was done by Huxley. So anyway, also they published a very fine periodical in which all of them, especially Huxley, wrote a lot of really valuable articles. So it was a real Mount Olympus up there at the Vedanta temple, you know. Now then, there was another, somewhat later in beginning, another movement from India, and I don't want to give them short shrift because their influence, the influence of this other was much more on the popular level. You know, when you went up here to the Vedanta temple, you kind of felt that you were, I don't know, you were in something like the French Academy, which are where all the immortals are. You know, it's a big, highfalutin intellectual quality. But there was another gentleman coming from a different Indian tradition who really addressed himself maybe a little more to the general populace, and he also became quite popular, and that was Paramahansa Yogananda. And he also became very popular. Like so many of these Eastern gentlemen, you know, once again, he bought all kinds of real estate, both in Hollywood and on Mount Washington and near San Diego and everywhere else. I think it's the wealth to the traditional Hindu, the traditional Indian is land and buildings. That's wealth, just like that was wealth, let's say, in medieval Europe. Anyway, Yogananda became quite important too, and his book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, became very, very popular, and he was, let's say, just an exalted yoga teacher. That's what was really his forte. Had long, wavy hair and big, luminous eyes, and he was still what nowadays we would call reasonably young, when he died a premature death at a banquet at the Biltmore Hotel, this was shortly after India achieved its independence, and I think the new Indian ambassador to Washington was the guest of honor, and Yogananda sort of hosted the event, and he was there in the Biltmore Hotel. He gave a speech and he keeled over and he was gone. So his career was cut fairly short, but he had already, let's say, built up a big reputation, and as it came to be called the Self-Realization Fellowship, SRF, carried on his work and still does up to this present day. Being a person somewhat partial to culinary events, I must also say that they organized the first really nice Indian restaurant with very tasty food on Sunset Boulevard, which was all run by volunteer help and employed recipes, so they said, that were written by Paramahansa Yogananda himself. So they must have been real good. But I tell you, it was really good. It was a nice place. You had to take your time because the volunteer help was not very swift in its movements, but it was really nice. In any event, these were the two sort of like the two pillars in the Temple of Solomon. These were the two mainstays of Eastern, primarily Hindu spirituality in Los Angeles, and I think each one in their own way did a tremendous amount of good. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that as of certainly all of the innumerable groups and gurus and so forth of India they primarily had a mystical orientation. I have never been to India, although I was invited several times, but I certainly read a great deal. I met many people who lived there for a long time, and its spirituality is pure, unadulterated mysticism of various kinds. I think Dr. Elwood, my friend who was the head of religion department at USC and who'd been to India many times, always said that Hinduism is not a religion, but it is a family of religions. In other words, they all have a certain common background, but they all have individual approaches, like a flower with many, many petals. Each petal is individual, but and so I think that that strong mystical orientation was of very great benefit to the people in Los Angeles or elsewhere who became devotees of these movements and who were influenced by its thought. And why do I say that? Because in spite of what Colonel Olcott, I quoted him last time, said, he used the term, it comes right down to it, the United States and American culture has a very strong spiritual element, but it is not, strictly speaking, a mystical element. The American temperament is not mystical. It is spiritual, but it is not. What do I mean by mystical? Well, I think that's the classical definition would be that is people who strive for and to some extent attain to a union with the divine. The mystic wants union with God. He doesn't want money, he doesn't want influence, he doesn't want power over people, which is a very commendable feature, shall we say, but he wants to go to the top, so to say. And for this reason, there is a great deal of power in that approach, and when it is not present in some fashion, when it's not available in some manner, then the culture is terribly impoverished. The Christian Middle Ages had, and were at various times, the salt of the earth, the saving grace of Christendom has been the Christian mystics. And there were some in each period. Sometimes there were just a great big bunch of them. They all flourished together. People, when Meister Eckhart and Tauler and the great lady saints, were around, but even at other times. I mean, there were always some people there, and they were the saving grace of Christendom, and I think they still are. Why? Because if you have a religion, then I think it stands to reason that you should seek and perhaps find contact with God, with the divine. You don't have to call him by any name, you don't even have to call him God, or him, for that matter. But when that is not there, you don't have a valid religion. And there are still people in the churches who recognize that. When the present Archbishop of Gomez of Los Angeles was inaugurated, he gave a big speech to the Roman Catholic priests in that ugly cathedral that his predecessor built. If you want to see a beautiful church, don't go there. But anyway, that's just an aesthetic judgment. But let's say he gave a speech, and he said to the priests of the diocese, it was addressed, and I can't quote him verbatim, he said, "You are priests, and you should remember that you are priests. We don't ordain you as social workers, we don't ordain you as politicians, we don't ordain you for any of those things, we ordain you as priests to serve the spiritual needs of your people." And I thought that was a pretty courageous statement of him to make in the face of trends that exist in Christendom. In any event, so that's really the mystical orientation. You are here to seek God and to serve God. And once again, from our point of view, what our God image, what our God concepts are, well, that's up to us individually. But the important thing is that there should be that striving and there should be that desire to serve. When that is there, then everything is all right. And so I think the Vedanta Society and the Self-Realization Fellowship, each in their own way, supplied a mystical keynote. You're interested in these things, you have to meditate, you have to do the various exercises, and you have to strive for the divine. Because if you don't reach the divine in this lifetime, then you wasted your time. I'm sure that Swami Prabhupada would agree, and so this was, I think, extremely important. Now, a lot of things could be said, won't be said, but let me say that certainly, since I am of the theosophical tradition, too, I would say there's a lot of mysticism in theosophy. But there is also a lot of other stuff. And it was up to the people to sort that out. Because the Theosophists said from the very beginning, that was Blavatsky's policies, we have a universal approach. We present to you everything that we can from the various traditions and so forth, and you pick what you want to use from there, and which I think was a very nice way of doing business, especially in the face of centuries and millennia of intolerance, religious intolerance, especially in the West, where everybody goes, I am the only one who's knows anything. I am the only one who's got the stairway to God, and nobody else does. So I think it was a very commendable emphasis. But I think the Hindu teachers brought, I think, something very, very valuable, and I think it contributed to the spiritual life. I think very, very well and very, very powerfully. Now then we have the whatever they call it, the lockdown is coming. So I have to concentrate on whatever it is called. When they won't let people out on the street and all that sort of thing. In any event, one thing I want to finish with, and I think it's very important. It's very, in many ways, very much the opposite of the mystical emphasis which I've been trying to convey. But it's extremely important and a very, very important part of American culture. I'm going to want to show these books, so I can't cover them up. I have all kinds of very good notes here, but I have to summarize them. We spoke, especially in the first talk in this series, about kind of a strange American spirituality that developed very powerfully originally in the Hudson Valley in the state of New York, and then morphed in various ways and then moved further west and then arrived here. Now a very important component, not the entire thing, a very important component of that American spirituality is what came to be called really only in the 20th century. I think I was here when that nomenclature developed, positive thinking. Has also various other names. Metaphysics, which is a bit of a misnomer, an appropriation from Aristotle, and various things like that. But when I came to once again, the old man is going to lapse into reminiscences now. When I came here, 52, 53, well, a lot of the people, including my theosophical friends, they were just wild about an author who was preacher as well, and his name was Norman Vincent Peale. And Norman Vincent Peale was an interesting fellow. I never went to hear him myself or so. He was really from a very conventional Protestant, but sort of mainline Protestant, not evangelical background. He was a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, really, and he took hold of a beautiful but somewhat run-down church built by the Rockefellers years ago in New York called the Marble Collegiate Church. You know who was baptized and married there for the first marriage only? Donald Trump. His parents were very enthusiastic there, and they were all big friends of Norman Vincent Peale, which is neither here nor there. It's not even in New York. I don't think the Marble Collegiate Church stands anymore. But anyway, so he was of a very conventional variety of Christian ministry that he exercised. But he got hold of an idea. And this, if you want to explore some of that idea and where it comes from and its implications and ramifications, I cannot recommend anything better than my friend Mitch Horowitz's book, One Simple Idea. How Positive Thinking Reshaped Modern Life is the subtitle. Now, in any event, I was even a little bit taken aback when that book came out just a couple of years ago, because I really like Mitch Horowitz to speak about other things than about positive thinking, because he knows so much. But when I read the book and so forth, I began to share his interest. Now, Norman Vincent Peale managed to, that's how he really captured a lot of people. He managed to combine a very convincing and fine interpretations of not everything, but of biblical passages. He was a good Bible scholar. He managed to combine that with his philosophy of positive thinking. And this caught a lot of people because they didn't have to abandon their Christian framework, yet it presented them with something else, and something that was very exciting to them. It was only toward the end of his life that I think in a weak moment, in an inadvertent moment, he confessed that early on in his life he was really very much inspired by a man named Ernest Holmes, who was a California and a Los Angeles man. And Ernest Holmes, in turn, is the founder of a church movement called the Church of Religious Science, which still exists, the Founders Church up there on 6th Street somewhere. And a very erudite man, and also a very, very charismatic individual. But what Ernest Holmes did, and not every, I have contact with people in Church of Religious Science because they have an academic institution which is called the Holmes Institute, interestingly enough. And they teach a couple of courses there even before the virus, only on the ether and by telephone and so forth. But any event, Ernest Holmes had gotten hold of a sort of westernized but still pretty powerful Hermetic teachings. And among these Hermetic teachings, he emphasized one particular aspect, that with what we would probably call now contact, with your consciousness, you can influence things. With your consciousness, you can make things happen. You don't have to do everything physically. Well, if you want to build a building, I guess you still need to build it physically. But you can do a tremendous amount with what's inside of your head. And while Holmes had been quite successful in his works and in his ministry, Norman Vincent Peale really made these ideas in his own way come to life. And the essence of it being that if you think positively, and I always go, what do they mean by positive thinking, you know? But when you think, in other words, if you conceive of some idea, you conceive of some project, and I'm making this very, very, I think that Norman Vincent Peale and Ernest Holmes would both come in the spirit body and beat me up for simplifying their teachings in that fashion. You know, if you conceive of something and you put enough energy of your mind, of your consciousness into it, it'll happen. And that's what that was, a revelation to millions and millions of people. We don't have to be victims of fate. We don't have to accept, I am sick, I am poor, I am miserable, my wife left me, my children hate me, my dog bites me, and you know, I don't have to accept all of these things. I can do something about it, and I can do something about it in my head. I can improve my lot, I can improve my character, I can improve my vision. And believe it or not, this was a tremendous revelation to a heck of a lot of people. Now then, in the Corpus Hermeticum, going way back to the time of the Gnostics and so forth, there is a good deal of material because it speaks of a divine mind. And that if you tune into that deific mind, which is acceptable to you, then all kinds of miraculous things will happen. But in the Hermetic books, the implication is, and I'm going to have to, I promised I would quit on time, and I'm not doing it. The important thing is ultimately that you have to reach into the world of the spirit. That's what it is all about. But Ernest Holmes, who was not a Greek scholar, although apparently, you know, a very astute man, Ernest Holmes translated the Hermetic word for the active deific consciousness in the human, which in Greek is called nous. He translated that as mind. And this became a problem, and it still is. And I often try to convey to my religious science students, you know, you've got to be careful because there is mind and mind. The Hermetic writings from whence Ernest Holmes got his inspiration and his idea, they knew that because they were working within the tripartite system of the Hermetic Gnostic, which means, you know, physical, emotional, then the mental, the thinking, and then there is the nous, the connecting link that connects to the spirit. And when you come to that, then you have access really to the deific consciousness. And then you tune into the divine will, shall we say. You know, it's not so much of what you want, but what the Godhead wants through you. And you have certain ways of dealing with that and accomplishing that. But this has been often forgotten. And there were times in American history, particularly sort of in the 1920s, in the 1930s. Of course, I wasn't here at that time. I was still arguing with the lords of karma that I didn't want to come here, I think. But in any event, the intentionality of this philosophy was not to be used in a primarily mundane and physical fashion, but it was to be used to reach higher. But instead of that, various people came up, and Ernest Holmes and Norman Vincent Peale sort of came out of that milieu too, that, we can tell people that they can get healthy, they can get wealthy, and they can get happy by way of the mind. And I have to finish. I keep telling myself that, but I'm not doing it. But I think that somewhere here there is I have a couple of words which I should quote, and these are from Norman Vincent Peale, wherein, let's see, where is it? Oh yeah, 3 steps. This is Norman Vincent Peale. Here, this is the formula. First, you prayerize. Second, you picturize. Not very good English, I must say. Third, you actualize. So that the issue is he definitely, certainly believed in prayer. You pray for something, then you visualize it. You make a picture of it, and then you pour your energy of your will. It's very much directed onto will, and then you actualize it. Now, of course, for the very first time I heard this from some of my theosophical friends, I'm a contrary cuss anyway, and said, yeah, all right, and when you did all that, then what? Where does this go, guys? Oh, well, you can have what you want. Well, okay, that's nice, but what happens after that when you got what you wanted? Of course, they thought that I was just an obtuse European, which I undoubtedly was. And this sort of thing has been brewing for some decades. And Mr. Manly Hall was very taken aback and downright antagonistic to a lot of this kind of philosophy, not necessarily to Norman Vincent Peale or to Ernest Holmes, but to others who went before, because he had seen in the wake of the Great Depression and so forth, come on, nobody had any money, nobody had anything. People were trying to counteract the terrible economic conditions with their mind, with thinking. And Mr. Hall said that what it developed into inevitably was to use an essentially spiritual element for material purposes. And he even wrote it into, in other words, in his great big book, which was his magnum opus. He identified that kind of thinking as black magic. Now, it definitely can be that. And if there had been any understanding of the, let's say, of the higher mind, the theosophists were talking about it, but nobody else was listening to them, then that can be handled. And there are all kinds of problems. I have a whole list which I have to use another time of what problems arise in connection with positive thinking, but I can just mention you. I knew several people. One of them was somebody who was a very close friend of mine for a period of time. And Oh yeah, yeah. With the positive thinking, you can use. And they do it, and they do it, and then they somehow run out of steam. And then what happens? Big disappointment. It no longer works. I was able to get a real good job. I was able to get a real good girlfriend or boyfriend. I was able to get a real good car. But you know what? No, it doesn't work. Nothing's happening. A very fine writer, Larry Dorsey, a medical doctor, maybe you have, he's written about a lot of New Age. He called this that what ensues is New Age guilt, which means it's not working anymore because I'm not doing it right. It's not because you are not doing it right. It is not working because you overworked it. You know, if God is a warehouse with all kinds of goodies, you keep taking the stuff out of there, and all of a sudden somebody comes up, okay, buddy, no more. You've taken enough. Go home. You know, which is of course a metaphor. It doesn't go on forever. It has its own limitations, and therefore that is a big problem into which many people within this field ran into. And so the issue is, it's a very thin line, and I conclude on that note. It's like the razor's edge path. On the one hand, yes, all kinds of things can be done. And as some people have said, Norman Vincent Peale said, and Ronald Reagan said, that in America everything is possible. If you go after it, it can happen and it can be done. But then you have to add to that's only a part of the picture. By doing that, you can prove to yourself that there is a magical quality in your, I want to call it mind, which is a bad word for it, and so forth, but that you should not stop there. That the power of transformation, the power of that the magic that you can do and that is within you, ultimately must be directed to the mystical objective of transcendence. And that when the transcendental element is not there, eventually it's not going to work. And in many instances you are going to come to an ill fate, because you are stuck in an essentially material matrix that you can't come out of. Have you ever seen the little hamsters or so that they put in a cage and they have a kind of treadmill there, and they run? They run and run and run, and they never get anywhere because they're still in the cage. That's what happens to us when we just trust positive thinking. The positive thinking will take us only so far. And then something comes and says no more. Because these powers were given to us not just to manipulate the material and the emotional world, but they were given to us to construct the ladder to eternity, to the divine, to that which transcends all things, to that in which all meaning and all transformation resides. There is the treasure, there is the grail, which for long time, maybe for incarnations, we have been seeking. And that is what we have to aim for. On the way, we may recognize that we have these powers. We may even exercise them. This has always been the province of lesser magic. But for heaven's sakes, don't get stuck there. Because our problem is that we are stuck. We are stuck in a world that we didn't make. We're stuck in a world that is contrary to our inner nature. We are stuck among influences and governments and tyrannies and lockdowns and things like that, which are contrary to our nature. Why should you want to go ahead and use your mind to get more stuck and to remain stuck? So it's a delicate balance here. Yes, we have certain powers. We are all potential magicians. But once we have become convinced that we can do that, then we have to address ourselves to the great change, to the great transformation, to the great alchemy, which is not earthly in nature. It has nothing to do with your health, it has nothing to do with your wealth, it has nothing to do with your emotional happiness. It has something to do with something that is so different and so magnificent and so astonishingly wonderful that there are no words for it. That is what we are supposed to reach. That is what we can reach. And ultimately, when these folks have said that nothing is impossible, that is not impossible. It is not impossible to know God. It is not impossible to transcend this world. It is not impossible to come to the real. And that is why it has been said, from the unreal, lead me to the real. It can happen. So you see, you have something here that is tricky. You can get stuck in the positive thinking, teaching, and this practice. But you also can use it as one of the rungs of the ladder whereby you reach the stars and beyond. May we reach them, and may our considerations of these matters have contributed at least a little bit to that journey and to its success. So I thank you very much.